So I think it's time for me to stop talking so that we can hear about these communities from our presenters. And it's my pleasure to announce the first speaker of the day, and I'll read a short bio about each of our speakers. Our first speaker is Michael J. Gall. He is Principal Senior Archaeologist at Richard Grubb and Associates, Incorporated in Cranberry, New Jersey, where he's been employed since 2001. He holds BAs in History and Anthropology and an MA in History from Monmouth University. He is president of the Archaeological Society of New Jersey and has directed, authored, and co-authored several hundred compliance-related archaeological surveys in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. He has received historic preservation awards from the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office and the 2018 Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Title for his book, The Archaeologies of American Life in the Upper Mid-Atlantic, 2017, co-edited with Richard Veit. Michael's research interests include the 17th through mid-19th century settlement patterns, landscape use, and dynamic cultural development in the Upper Middle Atlantic region, and he is particularly interested in archaeology's ability to give voice to and examine the cultural contributions of people who historically have been disenfranchised. So, thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Peter. So the Garrison Energy site was identified in Dover, Kent County, Delaware, but was formerly part of Little Creek 100. The site presents a rare and unique opportunity to archaeologically explore a free African-American household in the Delaware Valley, occupied by Richard Cooper and his family between the 1770s and the 1820s. The rural tenancy was once part of a larger dynamic community of Euro-American Quakers and free and enslaved Africans and African-Americans. Archaeological surveys completed by Richard Grubb and Associates identified the site in a poorly drained agricultural field far away from the nearest road. The field was part of a 500-acre tract aptly known as the White Oak Swamp Farm. The property was one of several farms owned by Thomas Hanson, the Cooper family's former captor. After the Quaker community pressured Hanson to formally manumit his slaves in 1778, Hanson allowed the Cooper family to establish itself as tenants on the back end of the swampy tract. Historical archaeological deposits associated with the Cooper family's occupation of the site included the identification of 47 cultural features and the recovery of just over 4,000 artifacts, which, by the way, is a notably low artifact count given that we excavated over 30% of the site. We also conducted geophysical surveys and geochemical testing. Coupled with the archaeological data and other historic documents, evidence indicates that the Cooper family acted as agents in the conscious and selective formation of a hybridized cultural, social, and syncretic religious identity that incorporated aspects of West African, Afro-Caribbean, African-American, and Euro-American customs. This creolized identity enabled the Coopers to foster important dynamic relationships with members of the free African-American community and the local Euro-American Quaker community. The resulting relationships, community ties, and social networks proved essential for the family's successful negotiation with and navigation between two distinct communities, that of the Euro-American and that of the free African-American communities, permitting family survival, social gains, and relative economic success. Evidence also reveals the family developed public and private lives. After gaining their freedom from the Hanson family in the late 1770s, Barbados-born Richard Cooper, a possible barrel stave maker, and his wife Nanny took up residence on their former captor's out farm. In an atmosphere of rampant slave catching, accusation, and abduction against free African Americans, residents on Hanson's out parcel provided the Coopers with an ability to have their freedom easily qualified against accusations of slave desertion that might have been made by others less familiar with the family. The protection afforded by the Quaker community may have also been a reason for the family's residence on the farm. Occupation on the farm also provided Hanson himself with a mode of surveillance for his property and kept the Coopers' home out of sight from travelers on the nearby road. In return, the Coopers may have supplied rent in the form of cash, services, or goods. The Cooper family was part of a clustered free African-American enclave that likely began during the 1770s when Quaker abolitionists urged meeting members to manumit their slaves. This community may have formed for defensive purposes to contend with discrimination and violence, as a support network, and to establish a sense of social continuity and communal identity. The community around the Coopers' home included enslaved individuals as well, and this dichotomy was grossly evident on the White Oak Swamp Farm tract itself, where at least 3 different tenant farm managers residing elsewhere on the property owned slaves. The farm represented a multivalent landscape, used and viewed differently by each of the ethnic and social groups who occupied the property, and was a microcosm of the town and county. The Coopers' home was of log or frame construction and lacked a masonry foundation. The house measured 17.5 by 23.5 feet in plan, with a smaller attached bedchamber or kitchen wing. Each room had a hearth with a wooden and clay chimney. The hearths were used to heat and cook, and at least one also served as a possible religious function. A front yard west of the house contained one well, a possible coop, and a likely laundry boiling area next to the well. There, family members worked and socialized in discarded refuse. And this 3D rendering is based on the archaeological evidence that we found at the site. There was nothing at the site when we were doing our excavations. It was just a fallow agricultural field. The Cooper family enjoyed a modicum of economic prominence in the free African American community in Little Creek Hundred. In 1797, the family was in the top 14% of African Americans and the top 46% of the entire community, based on tax records. Yard and pit deposits shed light on the family's household economy, consumer behavior, and cultural practices. This data also highlights aspects of religion and the family's desire to adopt cultural practices common among Euro-American families, while also retaining aspects of their West African heritage. Much of the assemblage recovered from the site consists of ceramic and glass vessel fragments. 29 glass and 118 ceramic vessels were represented in the assemblage. Most of the ceramics are teawares, though wooden wares were also likely used. The quantity of teawares present may have been part of an essential attempt to convey cultural refinement, morality, and intellectual development to visitors of the home. And in fact, there was several members of the white Quaker community visited the home while Richard was undergoing a process of acceptance into the Society of Friends. The Coopers also used at least 3 crushed grit and quartzite tempered wheel-thrown colonaware vessels. This ceramic type is typically interpreted as an expression of resistance to dominance, a demonstration of cultural continuity, and an exertion of identity. In the Chesapeake region, this ware type often takes on European-influenced forms and is very common on sites containing numerous enslaved laborers. However, only 3 sites in Delaware have contained colonaware, the largest piece of which is shown here, was found at the site and is considered to be that of a large flat-bottomed jug. This ware represents more than just a tangible manifestation of transferred African culture to the New World. It also serves as a symbolic representation of otherness that empowered a sense of community for enslaved and free African Americans of different cultural backgrounds. The use of colonware also suggests that free and enslaved Africans and African Americans in the community use these vessels to prepare and store foods to suit their own needs, possibly incorporating cuisines with African flavors. This may be supported by the recovery of sumac, a spice used to enhance meals. Found in botanical samples in the home southern hearth, sumac was also retrieved from the slave quarter site at the Virginia Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest North Hill site. It is unclear if the colonware recovered was produced or purchased by the Coopers. No other colonware in the region has been found that exhibits signs of wheel-thrown manufacture, like that found at the site, suggesting that fragments were part of vessels probably imported from Jamaica or Santo Domingo, where similar vessels have been found. If so, this suggests that market connections to the Caribbean were available and possibly important to the Coopers, particularly Richard, who was from Barbados. Perhaps this vessel was purchased for its nostalgic properties, representing pottery Richard once used when enslaved in Barbados. Beads found include 1 bone or shell bead recovered from a possible post hole in the eastern peripheral yard, as well as 3 glass seed beads from the home southern hearth. These include 1 white and 2 dark purple glass seed beads, one of which was found in a possible religious cache in the home's hearth. The purple beads contained beveled facets. Beads were commonly worn for various reasons among enslaved and free African Americans. Slaves wore beads to enhance their drab appearance of their work clothes, and faceted beads have been recovered from most slave cabin excavations in the southeastern United States. These symbolic, multivalent items of personal adornment were used to express, challenge, and maintain a cultural identity, signal information to others in the community, and enhance appearance and express personality. Some beads were also used for medicinal and spiritual purposes. In addition to elevating themselves economically, at least one member of the Cooper family, that is Richard, strove to raise himself intellectually and spiritually. In 1805, at age 65, Richard requested admission to the Society of Friends. As an African American, Cooper's acceptance into society is unusual. Acceptance by the Friends undoubtedly brought with it support from the local Quaker community. This is best exemplified by the creation of a Quaker Vigilance Committee that formed to rescue Richard's son, Aaron, who was kidnapped in 1811, sold back into slavery, and served as a captive worker on a Mississippi cotton plantation for 3 years before court ordered his release. In his memorial, the Quaker community showered Richard with great accolades, possibly to promote their own religious conversion and abolition aims. Though Richard never learned to read or write, his lengthy memorial remembered him as, quote, having no school learning and being desirous for advancement of knowledge in the best of things. He would, when opportunity offered, request the scriptures of truth and other good books to be read for him, esteeming them valuable in directing the mind to that source from which all true wisdom comes. His last advice to his children was that they should not fall about themselves for the little things that he had to leave behind. The memorial went on to praise his patience and wisdom and attest to his respect that he merited from his fellow Quakers and that of the surrounding African American community, stating, by the people of color in his neighborhood, he was consulted in most matters of controversy in which they were interested, and his good counsel always tended to, and often effected an amicable adjustment of differences. Memorials written in honor of deceased Quakers generally honored only the most highly esteemed friends. This memorial appears to have been both as much about honoring Richard himself as it was a tool of propaganda for the society to promote abolitionist aims. Richard and others in his family may not have adhered singularly to the Quaker theology. Archaeology indicates that either before or during his Christian conversion, Richard or another member of his family engaged in the African or African American practice of spirit conjuring. Excavations in the corner of the home's southern hearth identified a discrete cache of artifacts with a likely spiritual connection. The artifacts include 1 C2 atlas vertebra, 2 cervical vertebrae, and 4 C1 atlas vertebrae fragments from a young cow. So these are the portions of the bone that right at the base of the skull. These bones were not found articulated, and the upper vertebrae were largely intact, unburned, and did not exhibit any rodent gnawing, indicating that they were intentionally placed at the base of the hearth, possibly for a ceremonial or ritualistic purpose. These were the largest faunal remains recovered from the site, despite the large quantity of animals that the family owned. The bone, found with 1 pewter button, 1 purple glass seed bead, and 2 tobacco pipe stems, were identified under and adjacent to 4 large quartzite prehistoric Native American firecracked rock fragments, these are shown at the top of the slide, that had likely been gathered from the fields around the house and placed in the cache. Artifact caches with material similar to that recovered in the Cooper's hearth have been found at several sites in Virginia and Maryland. This cache may have been an attempt to create a family sacred altar, perhaps as suggested by Wilkie, to honor ancient ancestors. The cache may represent a form of Makisi derived from Congo or other West African cultural practices, and used by specialists to direct spirits, protect, diagnose, and foretell. Leone and Fry indicate that Nikisi can be put into 3 categories. The first provides access to spirits and includes grave dirt, kaolin or riverbed clay, and a funerary relic like a human bone. The second includes caches of vegetable, mineral, or animal materials that instruct the spirit through metaphor in its task. In the third category, all items in the cache are linked and directed to a person or object the conjurer aims to target, by way of objects collected from that person's clothing or body. It is unclear if the cache made by Richard or a local conjurer after Nanny's death was related to Nanny's death to aid in the recovery of Richard's son Aaron, or perhaps for some unknown reason. Alternatively, the cache may have been placed in the hearth during the home's construction to bless the home, land, and inhabitants with prosperity and fertility. Spiritual and ritualistic caches below hearths, under sills, and in corners are common on African American sites associated with both free and enslaved individuals. Euro-Americans also place concealed caches in homes to protect dwellings from unwanted spirits, such as the placement of shoes in walls adjacent to chimneys. These entrances require protection from witches and spirits who may attempt to enter the home and cause harm to the occupants. Hoodoo practices, for example, suggest that burying certain objects in caches can seal such entryways from these unwanted evils. Caches such as these were common in the Chesapeake region and appear to have extended well east into the Delaware Valley. Wilkie, for instance, has hypothesized that artifact caches represent physical manifestations of cultural creolization, a magical religious tradition, and syncretic religious practices. In light of Richard Cooper's adoption of Quakerism, one may observe a syncretic merging of Christian and African theologies by the site occupants. Clearly, the Cooper family acted as conscious decision makers in the social and cultural negotiation for access control, economic and social success, and independent identity formation. The Coopers' selective adoption of different cultural practices inherent in both the African American and Euro-American community of Central Delaware enabled the family to maximize its social standing, acquire support, and expand a necessary social network. Data reveals that the White Oak Swamp Farm and the Coopers' home were multivalent spaces. The use of colonelware by the Coopers, personal adornment with glass seed beads, and the creation of a spiritual cache in the family's hearth provides evidence of the retention of African customs in the Delaware Valley into the 18th and 19th century. Richard Cooper's acceptance of Quaker theology and acceptance into the Quaker meeting also enabled the family to better navigate and negotiate the complex dualities of 18th and 19th century intermixed communities of free and enslaved African Americans and Euro-Americans, the creolization that took place within the Cooper family, and the fluidity of the family's changing identity may result from essential experimentation in identity formation. This experimentation provided the family with multiple choices and avenues for inclusion into both African American and Euro-American communities. The same is true of many first and second generation immigrant families in the United States who selectively develop a plural identity to maintain a foot in two worlds. It is likely this experimentation and display of cultural hybridity is exemplary of that practiced by other free African American families in Little Creek Hundred and elsewhere in the Delaware Valley during this time. Thank you.